Man, last time we set up the entire code for the crafting system, and that was a big video. Today we're going to be making a UI to take advantage of that code, because right now we just have a debug key to test out whether or not the crafting works, which luckily it does, but that's not how you want to play the game, obviously. So let's take a look at all that. We're going to go into the inventory folder here, and I'm going to make a new user widget, which will be a widget blueprint, and we'll just use a widget that's called as WBP crafting interface or something like that. And to that we'll add a canvas panel, and this is going to be where we add in everything in a moment. But before we do that, I want to add in a other user widget here, and that's going to be the WBP crafting entry. So we're going to be making this thing here, which will be a we'll make it a size box. I like using size boxes for things, and we'll probably set a width override and height override here. Change this thing to desired on screen so that we can see what the actual dimensions of it are going to be. And then let's set these to, I don't know, 200 wide, maybe 300 wide and 150 tall, something like that. Those can be pretty nice looking buttons, I would say. Speaking of buttons, I think what we'll want to do is we'll want to be adding a button to this size box so that we can actually click it when we are ready to do that. And then I'm going to add a vertical box to this as well. We're going to actually be adding two vertical boxes. One is going to be outlined to the left and the top. And then this will be the recipe that'll be displayed. And then we'll actually wrap that in a overlay so that we can have two of them. And we'll add in the second one here, and that will be the items. And that'll be outlined to the right side and the top as well. And now we're going to get a step deeper again. We're going to be making yet another widget blueprint, and this will be the item display. And what this is going to be is it's going to just be a horizontal box with in it one image and one text. And this might look a little weird, but if we just set this to desired on screen, it makes a lot more sense. Let's put in a little bit of padding to the right side of the image here, like 50 is a little much, maybe even like 20, so there's a little bit of room in between. Let's actually go down to 10. Now we need to take in an image, the name of the item, and the amount of the item that we want to display here, because we're going to be adding multiple of these to both of these, and then we're going to be adding multiple of these to this, so that's going to be fun. So let's get started with the item display. Let's make sure that both of these elements are set to is variable, and then go into the event graph. And that way on event pre-construct, event construct, doesn't really matter which one we use, we can set these up. So let's add in a variable here for the recipe that we're going to be displaying. And if you've been keeping up with everything that we've been doing so far, you know that we have a struct specifically for crafting recipes now. So let's set up those values. First and foremost, we need the image. So we'll call that icon, and that will be just an image. Doesn't really matter what type of image it is, just an image. We're going to expose that, make it instance editable, and then we're going to also expose it on spawn. And we'll do that with a couple more variables here. So we'll need the icon, we'll need the name, which is of course going to be a string variable, and then we will also need the amount, which will be a integer. And with that we have everything we need. So the image is pretty easy to set up. It's just the image, set brush from texture, and the texture actually needs to be a texture 2D. So let's set this up as a texture 2D, and then we can just put the icon right into there, and that's kind of all there is to that. Then for the text block, we're going to set the text in the text block, and we'll get the name of the item, and to that we're going to be appending a space, an X, and a space. This is just for like a multiplication sign, just this amount. Actually, let's get rid of that last space, and then we'll get the amount, and we'll put that in there, and that'll make a string that has the name, a space, and then the amount that we need, and that's going to be how we set the text. This is all there is to this little element of the UI. So this now by default says times 0. We also probably want the text here to be aligned to the left, so that the amount of items as it grows to the right. And with all that done, let's go back to the crafting button itself, because now we need to go into the recipe and the resulting items and show those so we actually know in the gameplay what we need to craft it. So let's make sure that both of those are variables and then go into the graph. So this crafting button will need a recipe, and we'll call that supplied recipe because we already have a variable called recipe here. That will be of type recipe, the struct that we made for it. And with that, we're going to on pre-construct, let's get the supplied recipe, split the struct up in, and then for the items that we need, we're going to be adding stuff to this based on that map. So we've done this a lot. We'll get the keys from that map, and then we'll do a for each loop over those keys. And for each one of those keys, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a new widget. And the widget that we'll create will be one of the item displays, which takes in an icon, a name, and an amount. And wouldn't you know it, this thing actually has all that information in it. So we can get the item, and from that we can get the item name, and we can get the icon. And we can just supply those in straight up, nothing more to it than that. For the amount, what we'll do is we'll get the recipe, and we will just find the item that we're currently working with, and we supply that in. And that creates the recipe. And after we've created that display widget, what we'll do is we'll get a reference to the recipe box, which is again the box that's going to be over the left hand side, and we'll just add a child to that, and the child will be the widget that we just created. So it's going to be stacking those up in that horizontal box or that vertical box. And for the items, so that's the output items, we're going to be kind of just doing the exact same thing. So we'll just kind of like do this and complete it. We'll just get the keys from the resulting items and then put that into its own for each loop, where we're going to hook up the array elements here to all these things. And then we also need to hook up the map reference to the resulting items. So supplied recipe resulting items. And then we kind of just add the loop body, create a display widget. And then we're going to be adding that instead of to the recipe box, we're going to be adding that to the resulting items box. And that's everything there is to it for the actual item button. Let's do a little test here and make our supplied recipe. We can just make a mock recipe here for the default values. So we can set the recipe to take in a damage potion, let's say 5 of them, and then like a sword, 3 of them, and that will give us back a rock, 2 rocks, and then maybe like 1 health potion or something like that. Just as like a mock-up, so that we have that. Because it is an event pre-construct, it's going to show it in the design time as well. And there definitely is just a little bit too little room for this. So let's make this a lot wider. Let's make this 700 units wide. Let's start with that. See if that is enough. And then make sure that the overlay is actually set to being full horizontal and vertical. And then the recipe will be here over on the left side, and the resulting items will be over on the right side. And everything just works like a charm. And we can keep those default values just for troubleshooting purposes for the time being. And that almost makes this functional now. So we're going to go one step up again. We're going to go back into the crafting interface, where we're going to be adding in another vertical box. And we're going to be adding that here to be like outlined to like slightly more than the middle, I guess. And we're going to be, I don't know, just shaping it like this. Just something weird. You could just add this to the inventory screen itself, I realize now. Maybe. That would be kind of nice. That would be kind of nice, wouldn't it? Let's take a look at that. Because we have plenty of room here to add other things. So, yes, actually, let's do that. Let's add a vertical box here instead. And we'll just line that up with this item grid and make it something like this. And then we'll outline this to something like that. Make it scale up properly. And all that we're going to do is we're going to take this vertical box, make sure that it's variable. And then on event pre-construct, we'll get the data table row names, like all of them. And we will add in a data table for crafting. So that's going to be all the items that we have are craftable. And we'll get data table row, just the normal one. And that's going to take in the same data table. So that's crafting. And we'll just, with all of out names from the get data table row names, go through a for each loop where we just add every single one of those. So we just put that in there, that in there. And then if that row is found, we will create a widget. The widget we'll create will be our crafting entry. We don't actually need the crafting interface anymore because I've decided to just implement that in the normal inventory screen now. So we can delete that. And then once it's been created, much like before, we're just going to get this vertical box and we're going to add a child to it. And the child we add is the crafting widget entry. Now, there's one last thing that we do need to make sure that we do, and that is actually supplying this thing with the recipe that is going to be crafted. So that's actually quite easy to do. Going back into the crafting entry, we simply just go supplied recipe. We make it instance editable and expose it on spawn. Kind of just forgot to do that, to be honest with you. And then we can come back into the player inventory and just refresh this node, and it now has this, and that just hooks up simply like that. And if we look at that, we now see, hey, we have one crafting recipe that we can do, and it is for our health potion, or it's still called a health potion. Of course, it's supposed to be called a damage potion, and this will now scale up easily, properly, like left to right, so we can say, this is actually all that we need as far as inventory real estate goes, so that's quite nice. And now it'll be as easy as just opening up this data table, adding in a new row and saying, okay, we want to make a recipe that takes in something like 15 rocks and gets us a basic sword, just one of them. And now that we have all that, if we go back into the player inventory and we recompile this, bam, we have our new recipe right there, ready to go. Now, they are really on top of each other, so what we might want to do is go back into our crafting entry real quick and just go back into the size box, selecting our button and setting the padding for the top and the bottom to like 10, so that there's a little bit of room in between each one of them. Just makes it look a little bit neater. Maybe 10 is even a little too much, to be honest with you. With all that, we can now finally start making these things clickable. So in the crafting entry, we have our button. We can just simply put an on-clicked, and then we need a reference to the player's inventory that is going to be doing the crafting. For the sake of flexibility, what we're going to do is we're going to give the crafting entries a reference to the player inventory widget instead of just directly to the player inventory's component, because that way, if we at some point just decide, hey, this player inventory widget needs to display the inventory of something else, it's also going to be sampling that other inventory for the crafting system. So that way they always refer to the exact same inventory components. I don't see a lot of reason that you would change, like on a whim, what inventory components the WBP inventory player would show. But if you do, at least things will be consistent. So it's actually really easy to set up. We can just add a variable, and that will be player inventory screen or something like that. And that will be of type WBP player inventory. And we'll make that instance editable and expose it on spawn, as we do so often. Now we can go back into the player inventory, the widgets that is. We can refresh this node, and then it wants a player inventory screen, and we can just give that a reference to self, because this is a player inventory screen. And now that we have that, when we click this, we can use that to get the player inventory, and then we can use that to craft an item. And the item that we'll be crafting will be the recipe that this very thing shows us. And just for shits and giggles, let's put in that print string again so that we can troubleshoot anything if anything goes wrong, but everything should be going fine now. So if we start up the game and I open up the inventory, they are overlapping a little bit, but you can see that we have our little buttons here, and we can click them, and it says one of the items was lacking because we literally don't have anything in our inventory, of course. But if we then take like some of these rocks out of here and we take this sword, now we have literally every item in the map. We open this up, we can see there's a slight issue with it re-adding the old everything a second time. We'll take care of that in a moment, but for now, if we try to make a damage potion, it will just make our damage potion the way we were doing before. We can do that again, and we can use our new recipe easily to make a sword. So it takes in 5 of this slot, and then 5 of this slot. Maybe there was like 10 of this slot and 5 of this slot actually, and gives us a sword. And that's now just like that's in our inventory. Okay. This is a little bit of an issue because every time we open the inventory now, we're going to be adding more and more and more stuff to this, and obviously that's not what we want. That's easy enough to set up. We can just go vertical box at the very start here on event pre-construct. We can just clear children. That's something that you'll just sometimes need to do with these kind of things, and that's easy enough. And now that I think about it, we'll probably want to wrap this in a scroll box as well, because we're going to be having at some point a lot of these, I imagine. And now every time we open this, it's not going to be stacking up billions of different buttons, which is quite nice. Now let's actually do the anchoring for this one properly as well, so that they don't overlap anymore. I'm just going to give this one a little bit of extra room to that side, and then give this one a little bit of extra room to that side. Just a bit of a sneaky way to make sure that they don't actually end up overlapping. And now they look pretty good in the full screen view. And in this weird aspect ratio view, they also don't overlap. So that's good. Maybe this one could stand to be a little wider though. I'll just make it a little wider in general. But that's just going to be a thing. When you have a very square aspect ratio, these things are going to be overlapping. Here in the size box, in the crafting entry, we can set the minimum desired width. And we can just say the width override here, let's say that's 600. I like the look of 700 more, but let's say 650 will be the minimum. So now these buttons will never be less than 650 pixels wide. So even in this, you can see they don't start like squashing up over each other. And that's kind of that. Now that we're reworking all this anyway, we might as well like pull these two like up a little bit into there. The hotbar is going to be down here, and eventually an equipment thing is probably going to be up there. And now we have like scrolling, which is also going to be scrolling through this. That's just kind of something that we have to deal with. And if we add in like a bunch more crafting recipes, so we can just kind of like honestly add in a couple of empty ones because it's not going to be doing anything. But it'll add in some more buttons here for us. And you can see that we can scroll through these as well. So now we have an interface to be doing now crafting with as well, which obviously is much preferable to having it the way it was before. And there's a last little thing. If you are running into an issue where you're like, actually I want to have like 5 different inputs for a recipe, and then it's doing something weird where for instance I like have things going outside of the actual button. Also, I added some text here for intake and output. You can figure that out on your own. The issue there would be that your size box has a height override, which is going to just make it always be that height. So what you want to do instead is you want to do the minimum desired height to that. When you do that, it can still grow larger if it needs to, but it's always going to then take that as its minimum. So I am personally quite used to spamming the overrides, but you shouldn't do that too much. You should be using the minimum desired instead. And for the full course, if you're watching this in the future, it should be all up on the YouTube channel already. But if you're watching this shortly after it was uploaded, there will be a link down below in the description to the Patreon where you can find the full course. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page. A huge thank you to my Cave Student tier supporters, Earl Monseval Erno, and my Cave Digger tier supporters, Sir J. Thomas,